Okay, so today we are going to go ahead and continue in our series on greater than, studying through the book of Hebrews and how the author specifically talks about how Jesus is better than anything. Obviously, we know that Jesus is better than anything in this world, but in particular, the author is going to make the case for how Jesus is better than the old way that the audience used to follow, which is the law and all that. So, if you would go ahead and get started in uh, switching to Hebrews chapter 7, that's what we're going to be studying today. And so we said that Jesus, because of his obedience to holy life and death on the cross, in his resurrection, he's been placed as ruler over all things. And like we've said in the last few weeks, the emphasis here is not just that Jesus can say what to do to anybody that's underneath him, but more to the point here that Jesus' message is greater than any other message. And in particular, again, the message of the law that the Israelites followed before. That God's always desired our return to him, that he had put the law and the sacrificial system in place before, specifically so that we could be restored to him. But as we've said in previous classes, the law, the sacrificial system, didn't actually fully get rid of sin. It just covered over the sin. And so in Jesus, we have the fullness of God's plan because Jesus actually wipes away the sin for good. And so the author's point here is that to reject Jesus is to go back to a system that has been made null and void. And so to do so is to reject God. That Jesus was obedient even when he asked to not have to go through with the plan, but because of his compassion, because of his obedience, because of his divinity, he was able to serve as the high priest that we needed. And that as followers, we should develop such an understanding of right and wrong that rejecting sin just becomes this reflexive reaction that we have. So when we see something, when we're tempted by something, we're just automatically, no, we're not going to do that. Now, in particular, one thing that we should point out is that since the author is specifically talking to an audience who is considering the possibility of leaving Jesus to go back to the old way, uh, this argument of having this reflexive reaction to right and wrong, it probably actually has more to do with not just dealing with things of right and wrong, but of actually the fact that they are at a point where their maturity should be such that this shouldn't even be a conversation, that this shouldn't even be something that they're considering, which would line up with the whole conversation that the author has with them about you're not mature enough for the deeper things because we have to come back to this in the first place. And so, just as believers, we should understand enough that to reject Jesus is to go back and is to be something that we should just have this automatic reaction to that no, we're not going to do that. Um, so we're going to go ahead and read through Hebrews chapter 7. We'll do the two verses as usual. We'll start on one side of the room, whichever side we ended with last week. And then after that, we'll go ahead and allow you guys to ask any questions or make any points that you noticed during this chapter. Any questions that you have, we'll write them down on the board, and then we'll look at those next week. So we'll go ahead and have the video paused here, and then when you guys get finished, you can unpause it, and we'll continue on with the lesson. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is kind of like what we've been doing in previous weeks is we actually have to back this up first. So we studied in chapter 6 last week, and some of you may have noticed at the very end that the author just kind of goes into this really strange tangent about promises and oaths, and it seems kind of out of place because initially the author was talking about priesthood. They stop for this section about promises, and then they all of a sudden go back into the priesthood conversation. And so we have to remember that the people are in fear because of the persecution that they're experiencing, and some are considering turning back to that old way. And so the whole purpose of reminding them of the promise is that God doesn't make his promises the same way that we do. That God, when he promises something, even though he doesn't have to because he is God and his nature will never change, that he still makes that promise anyways. And so this is what the author means when they talk in this section right here about a promise and such, about by two unchangeable things. And so the whole purpose is to make this very firm case that God has made this promise, and as such, we can have absolute certainty that God is going to keep his promise. That we've been able to see that God has fulfilled his promises to Abraham, and as such, we can be sure that God is going to fulfill his promises to us as well. So now, the next thing that we need to look at here is Psalm 110, because the author of Hebrews really leans on this psalm quite a bit, and it's a psalm that's about Jesus. And so when you actually read through it, it seems pretty clear that this is supposed to be about Jesus. When you go to Psalm 110, it starts off by saying that it's a psalm of David, and then in the very beginning of the psalm, David says, the Lord, Yahweh, whenever you see Lord all in caps, that's what it's meaning. So the Lord said to my Lord. Now, if he had meant himself, if he had meant David, he would have said, the Lord said to me. And so David's submitting himself to someone else here. Now, you could potentially argue that maybe what David is doing is trying to talk about himself in the third person. Uh, but I think when you look at verse 4 combined with this, it makes this very good case that David isn't talking about himself. Because in verse 4, David has God speaking to someone saying, you are a priest forever. And so the author of Hebrews takes this to mean Jesus. And David never could have been even considered to be a priest because David came from the line of Judah. And so, because the author of Hebrews uses this in this regard, because God himself leads which texts get put in the Bible for us to understand who he is, it really does show us that the original intent of this was to eventually be about Jesus. That that all along David had Jesus in mind when he was writing this psalm. So the next thing that we're going to see here in verses 1 through 3 is Melchizedek's identity. Now, we talked about Melchizedek a lot last week, and we kind of mentioned a little bit about who he was. But I think what's really interesting here is that in verse 3, the author of Hebrews says, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Now, somebody might initially look at this and they might get to thinking that Melchizedek is Jesus in the flesh prior to his arrival, his birth in Bethlehem, because of the eternal nature of the language that we see here, without father or mother, without genealogy, beginning of days or end of life, remains priest forever. But we have to consider a few things here. First, this whole section about without father or mother, no genealogy, beginning, all of this stuff, none of that's in the Genesis narrative that we do see of Melchizedek. I mean, the amount of material that we see about Melchizedek is limited in the first place, but even in that limited section, none of that comes up. And so we don't have any information as to where Melchizedek comes from, but the I think the purpose here is that the author of Hebrews is less concerned about, or even trying to suggest that Melchizedek is some kind of angelic being, as much as he's trying to do this comparison and contrast of Melchizedek to the Levitical line. Because when you go through the table of nations and everything that we see, where we see all these different names coming down the line from each of Noah's sons, Melchizedek is never mentioned in any of that. But we do see the the heritage of the Levites. We see that genealogy. And so the author specifically trying to make this point, hey, look, we have the genealogy for Levi, but we don't have the genealogy for Melchizedek. And so Melchizedek is from a different line, and just like Melchizedek, Jesus is a priest in that order, not from the Levitical line. And so it's true that we don't have any kind of account where Melchizedek's from, but that seems to be part of the bigger argument here. Now, one thing that I saw that was one of the biggest arguments for Melchizedek being not being, I should say, Jesus in an early form, really lies at the end of that verse where it says resembling the Son of God. Now remember that God specifically is choosing what words are allowed in the Bible. And so as such, it's God himself that's making this point that Melchizedek was similar to Jesus, but that he wasn't Jesus. In the NIV Study Bible, they actually make this really important note that even in all of the old Jewish interpretations, they looked at Melchizedek as this model, this example of the Messiah to come. And so, in that case, it would make a lot of sense for the author of Hebrews to use this example of Melchizedek to a people who are considering going back to the law, because he's trying to tell them, look, yeah, Melchizedek was designed to be this model, this example of the Messiah to come, and you've seen the Messiah in Jesus. So why would you want to go backwards? You've seen the one that the example was pointing to. So after this little section right here, it talks about blessing and a tithe in verses 4 through 10. And so we need to understand how blessings worked. Blessings always worked by a greater person blessing the lesser person. And so when we look at Abraham and his interaction with Melchizedek, who's the one that's blessed? Abraham. Who's the one that does the blessing? Melchizedek. And so the interesting thing is that Abraham doesn't just accept the blessing from Melchizedek, he's also accepting the fact that Melchizedek is greater than he is and is fully authorized to do this. Abraham doesn't sit there and try and brag to Melchizedek and say, hey, excuse me, God is the one who has made this large promise to me. Did he make a promise to you? No, he doesn't try and argue anything with Melchizedek. He simply accepts the fact that Melchizedek is greater than him. And the other thing, like we pointed out last week, is that Abraham is specifically accepting a blessing from Melchizedek while he's refusing help from anybody else. Again, the king of Sodom specifically tries to offer him some kind of reward, and Abraham says, no, the only person who's going to have a claim to saying, I made Abraham great, is God. And so Abraham is okay with Melchizedek offering a blessing, but nobody else. And then there's also the issue of the tithe. So when the law comes about, everybody had to pay a tithe to God, even the priests. But now when you look at Levi, the father of the Levitical tribe, was probably around about close to 430 years prior to the priestly order and the commands for the tithes being given. And so the author's arguing that Levi, who couldn't have paid the tenth at that time because the law wasn't there, essentially paid the tenth through Abraham's tenth that he provides to Melchizedek. And Guthrie makes this note as well that the people were commanded to make this tithe. But when we look at the interaction between Abraham and Melchizedek, there's nothing that says why Abraham does this. And Melchizedek doesn't seem to ask for it. I mean, maybe he did and it's just not recorded, but Abraham makes this free offering of a tithe to Melchizedek. And so one of the commentators that I was looking through specifically notes how this spontaneous one is better. Uh, Abby can attest to this, that when we ask Hannah to tell one or the other of us that she loves us, it's nice, but it's so much better when we actually hear Hannah just say on her own, Mommy or Daddy, I love you. And it's the same thing here, that Abraham's tithe is better because it's spontaneous versus the commanded tithe that the people went through. And so another one of the points that we need to read through this morning is the change of priesthood that gets talked about in verses 11 through 16. So the author takes note of the fact that Jesus did not come from the tribe of Levi, but Judah, and that no priest ever came from or could ever have come from the line of Judah. And so the idea is that since perfection could not have been attained through the priest from Levi's line, it was going to require a priesthood of a different line, not in the order of Levi, to fulfill this need. So a priesthood not in the order of Levi, but as the author says, in the order of Melchizedek. And the thing of it is that once the priesthood changes, the law itself changes. And this goes in line with what we've already been discussing, that the author's trying to say that the old priesthood, the old system, is simply no longer in use. I mean, people are still trying to follow that old law, but what they don't realize is that there's no authority to it anymore. Because that law is gone. That law is changed. And it's not to say that when we look at the Old Testament, there's nothing there for us. We still can see who God is through that Old Testament, but we don't follow the law the way that they did prior to Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. And so the author is really suggesting again in verse 16 that Melchizedek never died by saying, on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. Now, again, when we see verses like this, it can make it appear as if the author is suggesting that Melchizedek never died. And again, that some people might try and take that to be evidence that Melchizedek was Jesus. But one of the points that we need to understand is that those in God aren't dead, but living. Jesus specifically tells the Sadducees this in Mark 12. When they see that the Pharisees' test has failed, they approach Jesus and ask about who would be, whose husband would this wife belong to if she gets married to a man and then he dies, and so she ends up marrying the brother, and then he dies, and so on down the line. So she's married 7 brothers. She's finally widowed, and she dies. So whose husband is she going to belong to? And Jesus makes this point that they've got this thing all backwards. And he specifically ends it by saying that God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. So it seems possible what the author is really trying to argue here is that Melchizedek, like all the other saints before him, is not dead because of his obedience and righteousness. I mean, think about when Jesus talks about Lazarus, he says he's asleep. And finally, Jesus has to say Lazarus is dead for the purpose of trying to get the apostles to recognize what's happened. But he always speaks of people as if they're not actually dead, they're just asleep. And so this seems like a strong possibility of what's happening here when the author talks about Melchizedek and this indestructible life is that Melchizedek, in his obedience, in his righteousness, he is in God, and so he's still alive. That anybody in God is alive. And so the main thing that we need to take away from this week is this idea that through his death and resurrection, Jesus became the perfect priest we needed to go to God on our behalf. That Jesus is able to fulfill the better priesthood that was needed. And we're going to see more and more of this idea of uh, an incomplete whatever in the old way, and how Jesus makes that the better thing when he arrived. So tonight, there's no evening activity. There'll just be PM worship, nothing after that. And we'll talk more about some of the other